I'm beginning my 33rd year at Hunter College.
Jason, there's no way you can be that old, or you got your PhD when you were 16. Congratulations.
Thank you. Among other things, I will say there are certain benefits to living in a large city like New York, beginning with the fact that I don't have a car, so I walk everywhere. And walking all the time, I think, does have its health benefits. But otherwise, thank you. Teaching for me is actually one of the most fun things I could possibly imagine, and I've always enjoyed it. When I say to you I was there 33 years, it doesn't feel it.
You just heard Jason Young from the Department of Psychology at Hunter College in New York City, New York. Eric had the opportunity to interview Jason as a part of our ACT interview series that was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in fall 2022. We want to thank Lindsay Maslin, director of ACT, and the executive committee of ACT for making space for Psych Sessions to record these conversations. And now, let's get you to the conversation between Eric and Jason. The Psych Sessions podcast is sponsored by STP. That is the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2. You can find them at teachpsych.org. The views or product endorsements expressed do not represent the views, support, or endorsements of STP. Psych Sessions is so grateful to have STP as a long-term supporter.
Welcome to another interview with Psych Sessions. I am so thrilled to be here with an old friend, Dr. Jason Young from Hunter College. Hi, Jason.
Greetings. Great to be here with you, Eric.
And you know what? I'm not going to be able to give the exact city in New York that Hunter College calls home. Help me there.
That city is called Manhattan, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
Oh, that little toddling town of Manhattan, huh?
Yes, and we are a bustling campus of roughly 4 high-rise buildings, basically, with 23,000 students.
Okay, so let's back the train up there, maybe literally, I suppose. 4 high-rise buildings with 23,000 students.
Well, that's their count. I don't believe anywhere close to 23,000 could be there at the same time.
Okay, so is it safe to assume that you're a commuter school?
We are a commuter school. Most of our students, if they don't live on their own, they're still living at home.
Is it also safe to assume, this, by the way, this is the great part of what I think is the great part of a podcast. I get to talk to people about questions or about topics I've never talked to them about. I didn't know that about Hunter College.
Yeah, well, Hunter is part of the City University of New York system. It is the largest of the senior colleges in that system.
Okay, let me come back to this. Let me put a pin in senior because I need to ask you about that. So, I forgot where I was going there. Oh man, I had a question. I guess so. Senior, you mean junior, senior year?
No, actually, CUNY is made up of what we call senior colleges, which are the 4-year colleges, as well as community colleges, which are the 2-year.
Okay, and the 23,000 students, all commuter students.
Well, yeah, I should back up. Hunter, I believe, has a dorm, a single dorm. It is not located on the campus. It's elsewhere in Manhattan. And I suspect that the students staying in the dorm often come under special circumstances. They may be international students or from elsewhere.
And how long have you been there?
I've been at Hunter. I am in my I am beginning my 33rd year at Hunter College.
Very good, very good. Was this your first job out of grad school?
It was not. My first job was as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. So I was in Austin for 3 years, and that was a great experience, a wonderful experience, very different from CUNY in the sense that Austin is, if it's not quite a college town, it's much smaller than New York, and that was a very different feeling. And I will say UT has a real campus, which is to say they have big open grassy areas and specific classroom buildings and far more spread out, whereas Hunter is a classic urban campus, much more compact.
Jason, there's no way you can be that old, or you got your PhD when you were 16. Congratulations.
Yeah, well, thank you. Among other things, I will say there are certain benefits to living in a large city like New York, beginning with the fact that I don't have a car, so I walk everywhere. And walking all the time, I think, does have its health benefits. But otherwise, thank you. Teaching for me is actually one of the most fun things I could possibly imagine, and I've always enjoyed it. When I say to you I was there 33 years, it doesn't feel it. And in fact, I'm hard-pressed to think, okay, do I know when 10 years were up, 20 years were up? No, it doesn't work that way.
You know, and for listeners who can't see this, he has a genuine smile on his face. He lights up when he says the word teaching. This is not an act. I hope you can hear it in his voice. I get to see it in his face.
Yeah, well, teaching, I mean, there's a whole number of hats that we wear as faculty. And while I love to do research, much of the reason I like to do research is because it gives me the opportunity to work with students. But teaching is that special kind of energy because it's transactional and because you get to see kind of the immediate response from people. And I'll take a side note here because we're coming out of the COVID era. And of course, we all went through this period of teaching online. And while I did it, I understand it was necessary. My own experience was after 3 semesters of doing that, I was done with online instruction, primarily because I didn't get the satisfaction of getting student responses, number one. And number two, students were a little shyer about speaking up. And possibly that's because we're all still getting used to Zoom and these types of online formats. But the in-person discussion class, and all of my classes are discussion classes. I teach large introductory and social psychology classes, which can have anywhere between 60 and 120 students, and then smaller upper-level seminar classes. But it doesn't matter. Even in the upper-level classes, I will stare students in the face. I will walk around the classroom. I will make sure that I can get as many students speaking as possible.
I'm going to say this gently and respectfully. I can remember prior Psi Chi board conversations where you were you know where I'm going, where you were not a fan of online education. And it's clear, and you have been internally consistent.
Well,
that you don't care for it yourself, even though you had to do it during a pandemic.
Sure, and just so I'm clear, I mean, that's my experience, and therefore that's my bias.
Right, which is okay.
I think there's something that in-person provides that is invaluable, but I fully appreciate and respect that there are occasions where students have no other option, right, and that is important. But psychology, I think it's very tricky to get a fully online experience and really get the full weight of what our field is about.
Well, it's a different experience. I mean, I've often thought about, how could you go to med school and not learn certain things if you don't handle a cadaver? Right. There's probably not, there's Sniffy the rat, if you, the bar press, you may not have to work with a rat in a Skinner box. You can do the Sniffy the rat, demo. I don't even know if it's still out there right now. But, could you really go to med school and not at some point in your experience work with a cadaver to, do dissection?
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
That kind of thing.
Well, the other part is I'm trained as a social psychologist, and we're still in the early phases of electronic communication. Relatively, it's been around 20 years, 30 years, and I'm talking about online particularly. And I think the human mind, the human psyche has really evolved to expect in-person, face-to-face communication. And while it can be an efficient way to communicate online, there are many things that are lacking, including reading the nonverbal cues from other people, which do emotionally and in other ways absolutely affect the flow of the conversation.
Folks, Macmillan is always here to help you confront today's toughest teaching challenges, like academic dishonesty. Their recently published Educator's Guide to Academic Integrity is full of ideas for using Achieve, which is their acclaimed digital platform, to take cheating off the table. And you can get it for free at macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions. So if you're tired of students putting more work into cheating than studying, then you should definitely check it out. And don't worry, Macmillan Learning has made it easier than ever to integrate Achieve's digital content into your course. Achieve for Psychology, engaging every student, supporting every instructor, setting the new standard for teaching and learning. Again, visit macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions to receive the Educator's Guide to Academic Integrity.
There's a reason why having a phone conversation with someone, you can hear their voice, but you can't see their faces. Sometimes we're happy they can't see our faces, but basically there's always something lacking. And so with online education, that for me is the piece that I find, is lacking and makes it a little less fulfilling for me.
Well, and let me just own my piece of this. When we record these interviews for psych sessions, we much prefer to do it face-to-face at a conference or a convention. During the pandemic, of course, we shifted to Zoom or other online programs that we use. But we too enjoy the face-to-face where we get to sit in a room and set up some microphones and we haul the gear, but it's worth it when you get to have this face-to-face interaction.
Well, it's so much more informal when you do it this way,
right? And it's more intimate.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you have a phone conversation. You often the voice can seem more clipped. There's a sort of a restriction in the types of reactions you're getting, and it's possible to misread cues in the way people speak, without being able to make eye contact.
So, what is your specialty within social psych, Jason?
My training originally was the study of attitudes and effectively how do we predict our own and other people's behavior. Because when we think about what people's attitudes are, the main reason we want to know how someone feels is because we're trying to use that bit of information right now to predict how someone's going to behave in the future. And I still do a little bit of that work, but I've moved on also to looking at how people perceive risk in a number of different ways. I collaborate with a colleague at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. This was someone who, in fact, had come to a conference in New York once upon a time, and we met up, and we've been collaborating for more than 15 years. But we look at people's perceptions of safety and the public's fear of crime. And, in times when we hear about how crime levels are rising or falling, it turns out that there's almost a lag between what the media says and what's actually out there. And that can very much shape how people feel day to day. It also seems to frame the political arena as well, because we know that politicians love to seize upon these things to try to motivate people, scare people into voting for one side or the other. So that has been a long-term interest. But I've also looked at things like math anxiety and how people's fear of numbers affects their day-to-day experience. Everyone studies math anxiety in the classroom, but how does it affect you when you go to the bank? How does it affect the way you think about spending and saving your money? Mm-hmm. So we're very interested in that as well.
Those sound like really practical, applied issues to tackle, and I think you hit it. I mean, even if you look at current trends, what politicians talk about, how people are framing, do you defund the police? Those types of issues, when people are presenting, no matter what side you're on, when you present things like current crime statistics, how you present them could frame it in a positive light or a negative light.
Yeah, well, and as most folks are aware, if you watch the local news, particularly the local television news, it tends to be the case that if it bleeds, it leads, is the common journalistic expression. But basically, we hear a lot about the most serious crimes.
Right.
And there's this thing called the availability heuristic for those who have taken a social psychology class. But basically, with availability, the more you hear about something, the more it convinces you that, gee, that must be very frequent. Okay, that must happen a lot. But the reality is, those often are the things that are reported in the news because they don't happen that often, but they grab people's attention.
Yeah, John Oliver did something recently in the last month on his show Last Week Tonight on HBO, where he did a thing where the depiction of solving of legal cases in the Law and Order series, in all the spin-offs, depicts the criminal justice system as much cleaner and more efficient than it actually is.
I have colleagues who that's one of their biggest complaints about student expectations. In fact, John Jay College in New York City,
right.
they're a part of CUNY.
They were featured. Yeah.
They're a part of our university system in New York City, and they have a very strong forensic psychology program. But I've spoken with colleagues who talk about how students come in expecting that there's a very clear and quick turnaround, and in fact, real life is beyond messy.
Right.
And so it's entertaining to see that on Law and Order, but the reality is, and if they really want to work in that field, they have to be prepared to deal with lots more hurdles, and that's something that's one thing the media doesn't always do a good job about, is that they want to present a narrative, they want to tell a story, they want to hold on to your eyeballs, basically.
That's right.
And as a result of that, you may hear things in a much cleaner, more direct way, but real life is much more complicated.
Absolutely. So Jason, one of the benefits of the podcast is that I sometimes take a little bit deeper dive. So let me ask you this question. When you were growing up, was the question in your house, will you go to college, or what college will you go to?
Both of my parents had gone to college, but both of my parents were first generation, to go to college. I would say there was kind of a push to go to college, but no, there was not a discussion about where I was going to go.
Okay.
In fact, even to my high school senior year, I was still figuring that out. And I'll be honest, my parents, my family was of very modest means, and we didn't even talk about, how are we going to pay for college? I mean, I had always thought, okay, I'm kind of saving when I'd get a check for my birthday or something. I'd say, I'm saving it for college, but it was a pittance. And my folks had a little bit of money, but that was a pittance.
Yeah.
And when we applied, this was probably the first major financial discussion I'd ever had with my parents. I applied to some smaller liberal arts colleges, which would have been wonderful to go to, but they were more expensive. And looking at what my father earned, they expected my parents to kick in X amount of money. They didn't have that. I ended up starting college at the University of Maryland. At the time, I was going to high school in Silver Spring, Maryland.
Okay.
And I ended up starting college at the local big university, University of Maryland, because it was affordable, plain and simply. Now, I did get the full experience, I moved on to campus. I was doing work study.
Did you join a fraternity?
I did not join a fraternity.
A huge fraternity row that's beautiful. At least now,
Yeah, that just wasn't in my social sphere. I was just in one of the dorms. But it turns out that I also was in an honors program at Maryland that allowed us to take a semester at another school and still pay Maryland tuition. And I ended up going, this was a wild card, to Indiana University in Bloomington. And I ended up loving it so much there, I transferred.
Colleagues, do you want to learn more about how you can easily integrate learning strategies into your Intro Psych course? Then sign up for a demo of the Intro Psych book, Psychology in Your Life, and W.W. Norton will give you a $25 gift card for your time. Here's why you should consider it. You've probably noticed that after 2 years of remote learning, your students need some extra support in learning how to study, especially in Intro Psych. So what if you could incorporate study skills directly into the content you're already covering in your course? Sarah Grisson, author of Psychology in Your Life, has offered us this integration. Here's what she did. First, she analyzed the learning science research to find 6 learning impact strategies that would be most helpful to college students, and then she synthesized them into the IMPACT model. IMPACT stands for improving, monitoring, practicing, attending, connecting, and thinking deeply. There are impact learning pauses throughout the book that offer study tips and just-in-time learning hacks. And Inquisitive, Norton's award-winning adaptive assessment, also includes questions on the impact strategies and incorporates these learning tips into Inquisitive's answer-specific question feedback. You're going to want to try this demo out, and they're going to give you a $25 gift card. So sign up for the demo of Psychology in Your Life by going to siegel.wwnorton.com/psych sessions. That's Siegel, like the bird, SEAGULL.wwnorton.com/psych sessions.
So I started at Maryland. I finished at Indiana University. They had a phenomenal psychology program, but I was actually a double major because growing up in the D.C. area, I was very interested in politics. And my first thought was, well, I'm going to become a lawyer or do something. My first major was political science.
Okay.
And, I thought, okay, this is an interesting area. Being a lawyer, I guess, is a noble thing, although, frankly, I was still learning about the law. But what changed my mind was a seminar I took on psychology and the law. And I will never forget the day I went up to the professor in the front of the classroom and I said, what area of psych is this? Because we just talked about psychological principles, but he never specifically mentioned subfields in psychology. I don't even know that I was aware there were subfields. I just thought psych is psych. And he mentioned social psychology. And I was hooked on social from that moment on, in large part because, as the Psych and Law seminar pointed out, law really addresses the way people are supposed to be. Psychology talks about the way people really are. And I thought, well, hell, I'd rather deal with the reality component and better, more thoroughly understand that.
I wonder if anyone at the University of Maryland back then ever ran the numbers on, when you offer this semester away, what the, for lack of a better term, the leakage rate was of students who did this, but then they weren't retained.
Well, there were several friends of mine who had done experiences elsewhere. They all came back. Yeah. But I think
what an interesting risk for them, Maryland.
Yeah, well, and it actually wasn't a college-wide opportunity. It was a very limited one. But yes, worked in my favor tremendously.
And we both understand that you want the best for the student. You don't want to hold the student hostage just because they enroll in one place. If they need to leave, you want them to leave.
Well, and the other thing is that one of the things psychologists started paying much greater attention to, but I think colleges as a whole are learning this, that part of what students do is when they go to college, they're learning how to learn. and they're starting to become more reflective about their education. Is this worthwhile, as opposed to just plugging into an automatic track? You say, okay, I'm just supposed to do the X, Y, and Z. I would say by my second year of college, I was starting to get it. I was beginning to get it. I didn't get the whole picture until much later. But I was starting to realize that maybe the opportunities aren't as good a match, in one place versus the other. That's what going to another school did for me. And in fact, it is now the case that very large numbers of students transfer. So, if not from a community college to a senior college, but even starting at one school and finishing elsewhere. And if it happens, that's just part of the experience, and people just need to be understanding that can happen. Sometimes it's not ideal because it can be disruptive. There's always one of the big questions at CUNY now is the transfer of credits.
Right.
When you've taken courses at one institution, will they necessarily be accepted elsewhere? Because I was early enough in my college education, the transferability factor wasn't as big a deal, but certainly if I transferred maybe in my third year and I had already begun taking lots of psychology courses at one school, would they be accepted at another? And that's a big concern in a lot of students' minds.
Yeah, but to give you credit, you recognized that something else looked like a better fit, and you took the leap. I think a lot of students then and now could not have overcome inertia and would have stayed put.
And overcoming that inertia, it was actually a very emotional period.
Yeah, I'll bet.
It was absolutely disruptive because the way I did it was pretty much last minute and at great expense. Well, the expense part, was going to be there anyway.
You mean like a regular 18 or 19-year-old?
That's right. And it was like whiplash. The friends of mine at Maryland were like, what the heck happened? Where'd you go? Why'd you leave us? It was a personal. And it really was a feeling like, okay, I think I better pursue where there are the better opportunities. I don't know where I got that from. I mean, I think I was learning how to go to school. I'd taken some courses that after the fact I thought, all right, this really didn't work for me and wasn't as challenging, wasn't as interesting. The other thing I know is on the back end, I stayed an extra year. So I graduated in 5 years, partly because I double majored in political science and psychology, but I knew I was having a great time. And one of the things I learned there that I pass on to my students is you will never have as easy access to a broad range of topics as you will in college. Because when you think about what courses you're going to take, you don't have to pay more for a philosophy course than a bio course. You don't have to, the barriers to entry are relatively minimal. There are prerequisites, of course. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you got to pay attention to that. But in terms of what you want to major in, you pick the thing that interests you. And, it's trial and error because most of us will hopefully go in a direction that works. But if it doesn't, yes, you may have to stay a little longer in college, but you've got all these other opportunities. And anything else in life regarding education is going to be far more specialized. Grad school, completely different animal because it is highly specialized. So when you're an undergrad, just enjoy it.
Now, that may be true at Hunter, although I think at Boise State, they have played with differential tuition.
Oh, I'm aware that there are schools that are sort of rolling that out, particularly in the lab sciences, because they'll say, well, this is more expensive. Engineering's more expensive. Yeah. It's not as widespread yet, so that is a major red flag, that could be happening, because the horrific part of that, of course, is a student thinking, I can't afford to major in engineering because those credits cost more. Most schools I'm aware of aren't doing that yet, but it is something that's on the horizon. Colleges are figuring out new ways to make money.
Or it looks like it's equal tuition, but the courses have fees.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's ways that I can tell you at my school it gets slipped in.
Yeah. No, Hunter has the same, particularly in the professional programs, the biomedical programs. Not a bio major, but although I think they do have a lab fee.
Yeah.
But that they sort of try to cap the maximum of what that could be. But we have a nursing program and a social work program, and I believe some of them are starting to tack on additional fees.
Yeah. So you grew up in Maryland, but Indiana must have been a sea change of a place to live.
Yeah, well, actually, I grew up in California. I have lived everywhere. I grew up in California, moved to Maryland when I was in high school. My father changed jobs, and so that was the point at which I think I'd had 2 or 3 years in Maryland before I went to college.
So moving perhaps wasn't a big deal, moving to Indiana.
You know what? Every move is a bit disruptive.
Okay.
I mean, I can't just say, oh, goody, I get to move. No, Indiana was a total culture change, and I sort of knew that. One of the things that did for me was it made me focus even more on my classes at first because I didn't know as many people, and I thought, all right, I've made all this effort to go to this distance. I expect that I'm going to focus a lot more intently on what I'm doing, but there was a whole world of opportunities that opened up there too. I mean, within 1 or 2 semesters, I got the lay of the land, learned about lab opportunities. I'd never heard of that. In political science, I had a mentor, Marjorie Hershey, who was phenomenal in political science. And I actually was an undergraduate teaching assistant for her. She'd pulled in 3 undergraduates along with 3 grad students for an intro political science class.
That's awesome.
And once a week I did a recitation section, and that scared the hell out of me. That was the first time I taught, and I remember I would break out in a sweat before every class, dry mouth. I tried writing down what I was going to say word for word, and then sitting there and reading it. So, and by the end of the semester, I got certainly loosened up a bit. But that was the first chance I had to really speak in front of a group.
So I'm trying to think of the timeline. In the time that you were in Bloomington, did you overlap with Bobby Knight?
I did. Oh, no. Indiana IU won the NCAA championship twice while I was there.
And were you a basketball fan or become one?
I went to 1 or 2 games. I was not a fanatic about basketball, but
Okay.
no, I did go to the games. And certainly when they won the championship, the campus erupted, and I was right out there. No, it was a very spirited time for basketball. I mean, that was religion there. That was
absolutely it was. And the red sweater, absolutely it was.
And Bobby Knight, and people kind of knew his mixed reputation even back then. He was a phenomenal coach, but boy, did that man have a temper.
Boy, could he throw a chair.
Yes. Well, and we would hear about that.
Right.
They had just built a new field house when I arrived at IU. This is long ago in the 80s. And he would personally get into fights with the campus because they'd try to schedule other things in the field house. And he'd say, no, that's mine.
Right.
And there were several articles about how you had to keep being reminded that, no, you work here, you don't own this.
Right. You can't have my player take a test then. We're getting on a plane to go to a game.
Well, there was.
Yeah. As a funny aside, Jane Hallen and I did some work looking at the Bill McKeechee archives, University of Michigan. And Bill once wrote to the athletic director there on behalf of, I think, the basketball coach, and said, the basketball team is traveling too much. One of my boys in intro psych is being pulled out of the class too much. I mean, and I think he wrote to the athletic director and the president. And so a Bill McKeechee would have stood up to a Bobby Knight. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that raises one of the big concerns. That doesn't happen at my school, at Hunter College, as much, but the competition between, shall we say, the faculty's priorities and the sports complex's priorities. And universities often use sports to attract their alumni back to campus, keep them connected, and solicit donations
and recruit students.
And recruit students, yes. And I mean, there's fun in sport. Period. Yeah. But on a campus, it's often a rivalry for getting resources. And do we build a new classroom building or do we build a new field house?
Yeah. And the trouble is oftentimes that the alums will give donations for the new field house, but they won't give funds for the new classroom building.
Yeah, education is not as sexy for a lot of people as, sports teams.
Right.
So
So at IU, did you become a member of Psi Chi by chance?
I was not a member of Psi Chi. I will tell you that my focus when I was in psychology was really learning as much as I could, but I'm not even aware that they had a Psi Chi chapter. I don't even know that anyone talked about it. It wasn't until I got to Hunter that I became very aware of Psi Chi, because Psi Chi had a very active chapter there. And the faculty member who had been the faculty advisor had retired, and there were one or two fallow years in the department where it just nothing happened. And finally I said, hey, whatever, where is this? Who's going to pick it up? And the chair looked at me, and this was, I think, my fourth year that I was there, and said, well, Jason, are you nominating yourself? And that was it. So, of course, I had to join Psi Chi.
Before we go there, tell me about grad school.
Grad school's at the University of Minnesota.
You stayed Midwest.
I did. Well, yeah, I was at Indiana. I applied broadly. In fact, I applied to many schools on the East Coast as well, but I applied to Ohio State. I applied to Illinois, and I applied to Minnesota.
The stronghold of social psychology, of course.
Well, and Minnesota, I will say, was the wild card, because before going there, I thought, well, it's one more program. I know who had been there. I mean, Leon Festinger and
B.F.
Skinner. Well, a lot of luminaries had been there. But it was actually the experience I had when I was there. They had a solid, cohesive group of graduate students. The faculty were very strong. But really the student culture, and I will tell my students now that when they're looking at grad programs, especially PhD programs where they are going to have to move far away, look at the grad student culture, because, in most cases, the culture will be very supportive and cohesive. And, you'll learn as much from the other students as you do from the faculty. But I've heard of programs where the students are a bit more competitive, and I said that's a bit of a warning sign, because you don't want to just be competing with each other to get attention from the faculty. What you really want is everyone works together. You generate ideas. Certainly, my career interests in what I research were gleaned as much from my fellow students as from the faculty.
Yeah, once you're in, the competition should be minimal. It's the competition to get in.
Yeah, well, the competition to get in is just between you and the university.
Right.
But, with other people that you're working with, you really don't. It's kind of a needless thing.
There shouldn't be. Yeah, that's right. So Minnesota,
learned how to love 9-month winters. Yeah, and I mean, Minnesota. I was in the Twin Cities. Beautiful place to live.
Yeah.
I in fact was just back there recently for a reunion.
For APA?
No, not for APA. For friends.
Good for you.
That's how tight the group of people that were there.
Oh, grad school friends.
Grad school friends.
Oh,
absolutely.
awesome.
Yes. In fact, not just grad students, but even some of my undergraduate research assistants, many of us have kept in touch, and I mean that, there's sort of a golden era when you're in grad school, because you're surrounded by other people who are interested in the same thing, and you assume that your career is going to be that way too. Oh, I'm now going to university. Now I get to talk to even more people who are interested in psychology. Except what you learn is, I specialize in social psychology. Well, I'm going to a place as the social psychologist. And if you're lucky, there may be a couple of other social psychologists there, but chances are going to be pretty good. They're not going to have the same focus you do.
Right.
So when we've gotten back together, my colleagues from grad school, one of the things we comment on is we miss the days where you could just take for granted that there will be people around who understand all of the nuances of what your interests are. Once you go into real life, if you become a faculty member, you will be the specialist. And there may be certain things you can talk about with other faculty, but it won't be at the level of the intense training you get in grad school.
So do you enjoy going to SPSP, for example? Is that where you reconnect with other social psychologists?
I love SPSP. I haven't been in a few years. My college, of course, has limited funds for travel, and so I try to spread it out and rotate between regional conferences, APA, APS, and SPSP, and ACT.
So I'm sorry I interrupted you. You were about to get into Psi Chi.
Oh well, once I became a faculty mentor, or I was signed on to be a faculty mentor, I joined Psi Chi. And so I'm one of the few who joined as a faculty member, largely because the schools I had been in did not have as pronounced a Psi Chi chapter. I wish I had known more about it back when I was in college, because I think it would have helped me, certainly when I was thinking about what do I want to do for grad school. It probably would have helped me greatly, because one of the things Psi Chi is wonderful about is bringing together students who are really motivated about the field, but are still figuring out what their next steps are going to be. And Psi Chi provides all these wonderful resources to help students figure out, is grad school the right thing and which type of grad program. But there's also professional directions one can go as well.
But Jason, I think you and I can be pretty self-assured that you've done pretty well, even without that early Psi Chi advice.
I had some amazing mentors along the way. So yes.
Yeah. And how did you go from Psi Chi advising at Hunter to regional vice president and then president? I happen to know these things about you.
All of these things, it's funny. I usually learn about these things at conferences, believe it or not, because you're sort of insulated when you're at your own college. Of
course.
I had gone as the Psi Chi mentor and faculty sponsor at Hunter, and someone said, you should be I forget the name of it, but before you become vice president of Psi Chi, you can serve on a panel that basically assists the local region for programming at the
steering committee.
The steering committee,
Gotcha.
yes. That's how long I've been away from Psi Chi. But basically, yes. So I joined the steering committee first, and then after a couple of years of that, in fact, there was I believe in my case, there was an emergency election because the Eastern Regional Vice President, Vinny Prohaska, had just been elected president, and so they needed to find someone, and it was an out-of-cycle election, and so I kind of quickly became Eastern Region Vice President.
Hey, wait a second. There was an out-of-cycle election.
I believe it was an out-of-cycle.
Did someone resign or something? Or?
Well, I thought it was because Vinny had been elected, and it wasn't typically the year, because they rotate how many years.
Yeah, there's usually 3 VPs one year and 3 VPs the next year.
Yeah, so all I can think of is maybe the year before Vinny had been elected Eastern Region Vice President, either first or second time, probably second time.
Yeah, maybe he didn't fulfill his
there was
total term.
There was something at the time that I was told, they're doing this now, and why don't you volunteer or at least nominate yourself?
So you followed. So Vinny had been Eastern VP, and then you followed Vinny.
Correct.
That's a great person to follow.
Yeah, well, it was a tough person to follow. Vinny's amazing. But no, so I got into Psi Chi and on their board of directors, and I served 2 years as the Eastern VP, and then 4 years as Eastern VP, because I ran for the second term, and then ran for president, and immediately rotated on to becoming president.
You did it back to back. There was no gap.
I did everything back to back. Yeah.
I think. Were we VPs at the same time?
We overlapped. Yes, there was at least 1 or 2 years that we overlapped.
I think I was a VP as Vinny was outgoing as he was past president.
Okay.
I remember him as past president. Then it was Scott and Alvin.
Yes.
They were. I was around when they were around.
Right. Scott Vanderstoep and Alvin Wang. Yes.
Yeah.
I learned a lot, but even better, I made amazing friendships and met lifelong colleagues. For faculty that are listening to this, I would say it's an amazing opportunity to meet some spectacularly active and thoughtful and caring people.
Yeah, I would say amen to that, brother. Only because it elevated and escalated my career to give me connections with people that I probably would have never met. It provided me with travel support to go to places that I probably would have never gone to. And I only served as Rocky Mountain VP for 2 years, but I got to pick my speaker. And my speaker in Denver in 2010 was Albert Bandura. Mm-hmm. My speaker in 2011 was Elizabeth Loftus. And that was those are pretty 2 good years.
Yeah, well, and it was great getting to share them with the students.
That was the best part.
Yeah, but you're right. I would say the years that I was on the steering committee, the board of directors, rather, of Psi Chi, were some of the most fun, stimulating years in my entire career, just because of the level of activity, because Psi Chi has some money and can do lots of things. We had a number of initiatives. I mean, they're always trying to give away grants and awards and that type of thing. The travel was very, very nice. And I mean, the travel in the service of getting to conferences that were really fun conferences. Huh?
Yeah, and I think we're so accustomed in psychology to working for lack of a better term, cash poor organizations where, there's no money for honorarium, and you have to ask your institution for things. And Psi Chi traditionally has been one of those organizations that could pay to send you somewhere. And when we invite a speaker like Albert Bandura, there was an honorarium to offer the keynote speakers at conventions, and that's because of student support. Honestly, it's because of the dues that students pay, and we tried to give that back to students in grants. And I think the last time I looked at it, it was $400,000 a year that are given to students in grants.
Good, yeah. I mean that's great, and that's a growth, because I think that's even more than when I was there, and. I mean, it really is an amazing organization to help students. And it's a matter now of just making sure students are aware and are applying and getting involved and taking full advantage of what it has to offer.
So, Jason, I wanted to come back to a couple of things that you mentioned. So you don't have a driver's license in Manhattan.
Well, I have a driver's license.
And you don't drive.
Yes, I don't own a car.
You don't own a car.
Although when I travel, of course, I'll rent cars.
But do you enjoy driving? Or
I enjoy country driving. I hate city driving, just as an aside. But basically, you live in New York and you see the traffic, and on a day-to-day basis, I'm grateful I don't have to deal with any of that.
So do you subway or do you Uber or what?
I subway and I walk.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned that walking thing.
New York.
I've heard of that walking thing.
They now have this thing for cities called a walkability score.
Okay.
And it's just basically how easily you can get around if you just walk or bicycle. And New York, of course, is off the charts, is excellent walkability in San Francisco and some other big cities. But basically, where I live, I can walk to most things. I'm about a 45-minute walk from my office, so I'll often walk home from the office. I started this about 15 years ago because I found it's a great way not only to get some exercise in, but to actually mull over things. Mm-hmm. And so my head's in the clouds a lot of the times that I'm walking home, but it's great to unwind and just think through, all right, here's a problem that I'm working on, whether in a paper or with an administrative situation or something like that. Okay. It's a good cool down period.
Okay. And something else I want to mention, and you are a really phenomenal photographer.
Thank you.
Where does that, and where I see your stuff is on Instagram. Where does that come from? And I mean, do you have training in that? I'm not kidding you. I'm not teasing you. I'm not blowing smoke. You're really good.
Thank you. And I got my first training at Indiana in college.
Okay.
I took a couple of photography courses. Unfortunately, I took them both my final year, that fifth year that I mentioned, and I was loving it so much that I actually was thinking, do I want to graduate yet, or do I want to continue and do more photography? And I thought, nah, I can come back to that later. In grad school, I took another course. I just force myself to carve out some time to do a little bit of photography. But it's always been a side gig, and it really is more my way of unwinding. I guess other people meditate, and I just take walks and take photos. And once upon a time, I was doing it carrying a big, bulky Olympus camera. Now with cell phones, I just use the cell phone camera, and they're all all I can say is they're impulsive. But clearly, I see things from a different perspective, and I've learned to just capture that.
Yeah, I was a Canon guy back in the day, and I've actually given all my Canon gear to my son. But I wasn't the photographer that you are, but the phones these days can do amazing things. And you have I can't characterize it, but you have a knack for light.
Yeah.
You like to play with, you see lighting does something differently or surprisingly, and you tend to try to capture that, how I would say it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I actually had a college professor who said, you like the contrasty stuff.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I mean, light and shadow. And
right.
New York, it's interesting. New York is an amazing city. What it is not is a beautiful city. And I'm thinking about like natural nature. Okay. Well, I grew up in California near San Francisco, and I think that's the most beautiful city, is my bias. Okay. But nature to me is really colorful and soothing and gorgeous. Mm-hmm. New York is not that way. In fact, if anything, New York I often see as it's really a town made for black and white photography.
Okay.
Because it really is about contrast. There's interesting shapes. There's interesting shades of gray. But what New York City is not is a colorful city. I mean, there can be colorful spaces like Times Square, which is over the top, billboards and flashing lights. But the city as a whole, it provides really interesting contrasts. And so that's what stimulates me to take photos. The other option, of course, is I walk by the Hudson River, and there I'll catch sunsets, and that's where you'll see a lot of color.
They're great. So is the only place that you post those on Instagram?
Yes, and only because that's all I know. Someone showed me how to use Instagram about 5 or 6 years ago, and I just started posting there. Apparently, they also post on Facebook. I have an account, but I never actually post anything there. But it shows up there too.
And are you at Jason Young?
Well, the
on Instagram.
Oh, it's Jason in NYC. JASONINNYC.
Okay, so when this episode releases, I'll put that in the show notes.
Sure.
So if people want to get on there and look at your work. Every time I get on Instagram, obviously it's in my feed because I follow you, and they're beautiful. And I hope you've seen that occasionally I comment on
you
how
do,
beautiful
and I appreciate that.
are.
Yeah,
and there may be times in the future that I grab them for a PowerPoint. I will contact you and ask your permission.
Wow. Yeah.
Because I believe in respecting intellectual property, and
well, thank you.
Yours.
I much appreciated.
Yeah, and that's awesome. Oh, I've almost used an hour of your time, Jason. Was there anything that, thinking about today, that you wanted to mention, or you wanted me to ask you, or was there anything? I thought he was going to ask me this, or anything like that.
Actually, there isn't, other than it's a wonderful opportunity to see you again and
it's great.
get to speak and just kind of pour out my life as a psychologist. So.
Well, and it's the kind of thing, what I've discovered over doing this with Garth Neufeld for 5 years is that even when colleagues go to dinner and they talk about things, we never ask each other about where you grew up or did your parents go to college or those types of things. It just doesn't come up, or it's too intimate or too personal. But face to face like this, I guess I've become more comfortable just asking it. And if people are uncomfortable, we just edit it out, and no one will ever know the difference. So.
Sure. Well, and I would say, just to put in a plug for Psi Chi, I found in my experience in speaking with students, this is not the sort of thing you talk about in a class, but this is the sort of thing you could talk about at a social. And one of the wonderful things that Psi Chi can do is bring students and faculty together out of the classroom. And I think it's invaluable for students to hear about their faculty members' life stories, only because who you might identify with. Everyone wants to believe, oh, well, no one's going to appreciate my track, or I'm an outsider, I'm different from everyone else. And the reality is there's some overlap that can be really appreciated, but only if you get the chance to talk about it.
I'll tell you what, I'll see your story and I'll raise you. Not that one-upmanship should be the idea. You could take the Psych Sessions episode we just recorded and play it in a classroom or assign it as a homework assignment and have them listen to Dr. Jason Young.
As soon as it's posted and I get that notice, I will do so.
Well, there you go. Well, Jason, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you, Eric. This has been a great opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you.